I've been around the Texas legislature for almost 20 years. You, of course, the plural you, and I'll be using the plural you like in the Bible pretty much throughout this presentation. Y'all have been doing this since 1988. But I saw how many first-timers we had here, and that is terrific. So for those of you who are first-timers, I want to start off by really making sure that you know who we are and why we are going to say what we are going to say. Texas Impact is the membership organization for the state's mainline Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim denominations in the state. We promote public policy consistent with the positions of those member denominations. So if you are here, it is practically certain that your denomination is a member. So I want to kind of get into this a little bit. So in your materials, at the back of tab 3 in your binder, you have a copy of the legislative agenda. Those are our member institutions. You can see why I say it's practically certain. It's a big old long list. It looks like this. We want to make sure that you understand the process by which we can say that this legislative agenda is your legislative agenda. Our board of directors sets our legislative agenda and tells staff what our positions are. Our board of directors is appointed by you. Your denomination sends representation to our board, as does the United Women in Faith. We cannot take positions that conflict with your faith community's positions. Of course, your personal feelings may differ, but that is for you to take up with your faith community. This is a communal process. We go into this detail because we have to talk about elections. Your agenda, the one that's on here, did not go well. It has not gone well this decade. As your professional lobbyist, we must tell you that if we want different outcomes, then we are going to have to do the accountability work of citizens of a democracy at the ballot box. For a membership organization whose commitment is to issues, this differs from the daily dose of partisan politics that the media feeds you. It is a different way of thinking, which we're going to spend most of our time today exploring. But if you care about issues, then you must vote in each and every election, not just the general election in November. By this, I mean party primaries and local elections. And in Texas, a person may vote in whatever party primary they wish. Are the choices always ideal? No. I can think of one election in my lifetime where I walked into the ballot box and I thought I had an ideal choice, and it was just for one office, and I was disappointed. We have to get realistic about it. It's like public transportation. You choose the bus that gets you closest to work. You don't get to miss work just because the bus doesn't drop off right in front of the building and it's raining that day. Now, Texas Impact does not endorse. Nothing in here is going to be an endorsement. Obviously, that choice is yours. But it is our job to provide you with a map of the routes, metaphorically speaking, so that you can navigate it based on where you live and where you want to get to. Those maps are in tab 4. They are quite detailed maps, so we're going to also spend a good bit of time making sure we know how to use them. So let's start with the calendar. The March primary is in 5 weeks on March 5th. Early voting is in 3 weeks on February 20th. This time, the primary policy issue at stake is overwhelmingly on the Republican side, and that issue is the future of public education in Texas. On May 4th, we will have a number of city and school board elections. It is important to remember that somewhere in Texas, we are electing a school board every 6 months. School boards can choose May or November. They can choose even-numbered years or odd-numbered years. They define their own terms. And here's the important thing to remember. how a local government implements the policies of the state has flexibility. We will use the school chaplain bill here in a little bit at our workshop as an example, a little more of what we mean by that flexibility, but how your local school boards implement state policy can vary wildly and is super important. On May 28th, we will have the primary runoffs. So in Texas, you have to win a majority of the vote to advance to the general election. And then we will have a long, hot summer where the general election will dominate the news. Whatever happens in November, we need to make sure that you understand two things about the next 3 elections in Texas that will happen in the next 4 months. 1, we cannot fix Washington, D.C. until we can win school board races. Number 2, the next 2 to 4 months will be crucial and dire for public education in Texas. So let's start with the first. We cannot fix Washington, D.C. until we can win school board races for at least 2 reasons. 1, it's just math, fractions to be precise. Your vote is most potent locally. You see why? Your fraction of your vote is bigger. The number of people voting is smaller. 2, it's structural. Where do you think elected officials get the experience and make the connections to run for those offices that represent more people? Local government and school boards. So be disciplined. Don't let whatever is happening nationally distract you from your community. Now let's talk about why the primary is crucial and dire for public education. We really debated what adjective to use here. Calling it existential probably crosses the border between accuracy and hyperbole. So whatever is one step down from that. It isn't nuclear war, but DEFCON 2, a Cuban Missile Crisis level of seriousness for public education. Let's talk about vouchers and HB1. The reason we say this is because of what a voucher is. A voucher is any diversion of public money for private education. The voucher bill we spent 4 special sessions battling literally takes money from rural and low-income schools and gives it disproportionately to wealthy suburban parents that already have their kids in private school. It is a welfare program for the rich. In Texas, we spend $6,160 per pupil in our public schools. HB1 entitled those wealthy suburban parents to a check from the government for $10,000 per child. They would spend more for private school children than they would for a public school child. And despite rampant inflation and a budget surplus, the governor is quite openly saying any more money for public schools will be vetoed unless we surrender on vouchers. It is a hostage situation for public education. After 4 special sessions, it appears at this hour, on this day, as I say this at least, that the governor is content taking it to the primary voters. And he is raising a lot of money to purge the Republican Party of any dissent. $6 million was just one donation. He is sitting on a $40 million war chest. And this does not account for the DeVos money nationally, called the AFC Victory Fund, or the state level equivalent, which is called the Family Empowerment Coalition PAC, or the far right Midland money called Texans United for a Conservative Majority. Now, some of the candidates will try to convince you that it's a both-and situation. They'll say, our economy is strong. We can be both for more money for public schools and vouchers. They'll call them ESAs. All right. Yeah, some political consulting firm made that up. If you hear that, remind them of 2011. How many of you remember 2011? For those who may not, the economy tanked and Texas had a $27 billion with a B dollar shortfall. They cut $5 billion with a B from public education. They never fully restored it. So let's game out the challenges if vouchers were to be traded for more money for public education. Someday we'll hit another bad economy. But now there are private schools reliant on the government subsidy. Those private schools already have lobbyists, and they already have legal ways to engage in electoral work. They would talk all about the schools that are going to close if you cut us. We hear this all the time as lobbyists in any number of industries. They would scare their parents and mobilize them to lobby. And it wouldn't be hard since those parents want to keep the check coming for their government entitlement program. I mean, who doesn't want $10,000 to do what you're already doing? And if you have multiple kids, public schools, by contrast, cannot engage in electoral work. They're always getting threatened by the Attorney General for things that aren't electoral work, but look close enough to be, something that they'll try to scare them about. And the same forces that want vouchers have been trying to ban public schools from lobbying for the last 3 sessions now. In a budget crisis, it's a zero-sum game. So imagine that lobby battle over whether the public schools or the private schools get cut during a budget shortfall. This is the long-term structural problem that gets created if there's any compromise on vouchers. Appropriations are short-term. They last for 2 years and they can be taken away. The voucher would likely remain for quite a while in a best-case scenario, slowly bleeding the public system until we have an even more unequal 2-tier education system, more separate and more unequal. It will not happen overnight, but slowly, like the psychological metaphor of the frog in boiling water, right? In case you're curious about this slide, this is the cover of a legislative committee's report from 1956, right after Brown versus Board. If you can't read it from where you're sitting, it says, Report of the Legal and Legislative Subcommittee of the Texas Advisory Committee on Segregation in the Public Schools. One of its recommendations to maintain segregation was to create a voucher program. This is Representative Virginia Duff of Mansfield. She carried the bill. Mansfield ISD was the site of a big racial riot over integration. Before there was the Little Rock in Arkansas, there was Mansfield ISD. It was an election year and Governor Eisenhower didn't intervene the way he did 1 year later after the election was over in Little Rock. It would have passed, but for a record, at that time it was a record, 36-hour filibuster by Henry B. Gonzalez of San Antonio. This is the modern resurrection of vouchers. So after 4 special sessions, where are we at? Your advocacy, your letters, your calls, your organizing defeated school vouchers for now. Often, many of you have ever asked me, does it really matter if we do this? Rarely do we get to see it this plainly. This is an article where Representative Glenn Rogers just outright says it was constituent pressure. We asked for their vote, we got it. Now, we have to support their vote with our vote. So we've made resources for you, but to understand why they are so focused on the Texas House and why we are so focused on vouchers, you need to understand that the House and the Senate hate each other. It's not hyperbole. In the Senate, the lieutenant governor is the only vote that matters. While the Republican senators make the rules, they have acquiesced for electoral reasons that you will understand here in a bit. The Speaker, by contrast, is elected by the whole House, not the majority party, like in Washington, D.C. However, many of the same folks that want vouchers also want a partisan election of the Speaker to make Texas more like Washington, D.C. In each session, the Lieutenant Governor catapults diseased corpses and flaming tar balls of bad legislation at the House. The purpose is so that they can then purge the Republican Party in the next primary by inflaming certain voters to turn out and vote for the most extreme candidate. Here's how it works. So if you are able, if you are able, could you please stand so that I can demonstrate how this works? You represent the 22 million Texans that could be voting. You're 18, you're a citizen, you're not currently serving a felony sentence. Right off the bat, 1 in 5, 19%, are not registered to vote. So if I can have the first 4 rows of this side of the room, that is close enough for our purposes. Sit down. Y'all are not registered. You are not driving the policy conversations because you're not voting. In a presidential election year, this is the highest turnout you'll ever see. So in 2024, we're likely to have pretty high turnout in November. In 2020, only half voted in the last presidential election for all the candidates combined. So if I could have everybody from here over sit down. 52% was a record in 2020. It was the very first time in Texas history that over 50% of the voting age population participated in any election. In a midterm, or what we call a gubernatorial year, it varies. 2018 was a record at 42%. So if I could go ahead and have this first row sit down, that'll be close enough for our purposes at 42%. Because 2018 looked like a presidential year. 2022, however, was 37%, which is a little bit smaller. It's probably these first 2 rows right here. But hang on, don't sit down just yet. I want to talk about y'all a little bit. In case you're curious, that decrease of 5% turnout is the difference between Beto O'Rourke losing by 2.5 and losing by 11. Why is that? I'll tell you. It's because of where the decrease occurred. Rural Texas had no decrease in turnout. Rural Texas is 75-25, Republican to Democrat. It has been for 20 years. It is not trending any way but redder. Suburbia is a wash. It's about 52-48. Which way depends on who turns out. Suburbia is getting bluer, but slowly over decades. It does not happen immediately. So it was urban Texas that was the difference. So y'all were the suburban voters. Y'all can sit down. It was these urban voters right here that were the difference. Because urban Texas, when I say urban Texas, I really mean 5 counties. I mean Dallas, Harris, Travis, Bexar, and El Paso. They are the opposite of rural Texas at 70-30. So when you have 10% decrease in urban turnout, that was the difference in the race. So y'all sit down. But turnout has been up over the last couple cycles. In 2014, it was 25%. So everybody over here can sit down. And 25% was the average until recently, really the last 2 midterms. So it is trending the right direction, still very low. But I've been talking about November. November isn't the race that matters most. 95% of the Texas legislature is effectively decided in the primaries. That's due to gerrymandering. In the 150-member Texas House, there are only 4 true swing seats. Maybe 11 in a really unusual year. Really unusual. I've seen it once in my life where somebody won by 10 percentage points, and it was the 2010 election where Democrats went from 74 seats to 49. So that means the primary is the most important race, and that has been true for most of Texas history, if you know your Texas history. Right? We had white primaries. We didn't need to segregate the general election. We segregated the primaries 100 years ago. Primaries are only 14% of the state. That's both parties combined. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. This is perfect. Okay, so everybody sit down, and you can sit down. Everybody back here, go ahead and sit. These are the 14 primary voters. Could y'all do me a favor and come on up here so everybody can see you if you're able? If you're not able, then we can do it from where you're at. Let's do it from where you're at. I'm sorry. I'm going to make this hard for y'all, and I don't need to. I don't want y'all standing for too long, but it's going to be a little bit. So y'all stay close. All right, that's both parties combined. Both parties. So back here, 5, y'all are Democrats. These 5 voters elect 67 House seats.
Don't make me a Republican.
Oh, it's going to get worse. Republicans are the other 9. Of those 4, this row, are the traditional Republicans, the business Republicans. These 5, on this middle row, are what we used to call the Tea Party or MAGA Republicans. Now, while I've got y'all standing up, we need to talk about school boards and city councils for a second. Both school boards and city councils are nonpartisan elections in Texas. That means they do not go through a party primary. As a general rule, this favors centrists. And that's why most school boards and city councils have not lost their mind. It's also why the partisans are attacking them, if you've paid attention to your local races lately. Okay. So in those races, these traditional R's, right here on this row, and these D's are able to coalesce around a reasonable candidate. This works both ways. If it's a more Republican-leaning area, then they coalesce around a traditional Republican. It also works on the other way. Just see the Mayor Watson winning over the far left in Austin, Mayor Whitmire winning over the far left in Houston. Same dynamic. Works both ways. It's also true on school boards, at least when it's a 2-person race. So let's talk about school boards for a second, because some have made news by taking up the culture wars. Have y'all seen that news? Is this news to anybody? Okay. Here's why that's happening. Not every school board goes to a runoff. That means that a plurality, the person who gets the highest vote total, even if it's not a majority, wins. So, in places like Grapevine, Colleyville, or Cy-Fair just had this happen, those went to the far right candidate because progressives and centrists ran competing candidates and split the vote. 40, 30, 30. So every school board race that we've looked at has been, quote unquote, taken over by the far right Christian nationalists. They never get a majority of the vote. They get 40% at the highest because the progressives and the centrists have split in a 3-way race in school boards. Let's turn back to party primaries for a second so we can talk about runoffs. For this, Democrats, you may sit down. You've not won a statewide race since 1994, and your number of seats are just not big enough to be driving the conversations. With some exceptions, I should say. You're not running competitive primaries, and you're not running competitive general elections because you're gerrymandered into these 80% Democratic seats. So as a party, Democrats, you should really ask yourself, if we aren't having competitive primaries or competitive generals, when are we engaging voters? So in Texas, you have to win a primary with a majority, 50% plus 1. Turnout drops even further in runoffs. If you can do percentages in your head, we're going to have, it goes from 5-4 to 3-2. So let's have 2 sit and 2 sit. And y'all 2 can sit. So now we have these 5 people in a 3-2 race. And if you can do those percentages in your head, you can tell that it slightly favors right now the MAGA Republicans, who are more committed and more passionate and showing up in slightly greater numbers in a runoff. In 2012, Senator Cruz won a runoff with 3.5% of Texas's voting age population affirming him at the ballot box. In 2014, Lieutenant Governor Patrick won with 2.5% of Texas's voting age population affirming him at the ballot box. This dynamic continues to play out all the way down ballot and has for a decade now. So in a nutshell, roughly 3% of the state, which is about 700,000 Texans, are driving the policy conversations. They've captured every statewide office, they've captured the Texas Senate, and they are close and on the verge of the Texas House. All right, thank y'all for standing up. So every time we do this, somebody asks, should I be voting in a certain party's primary? And every time we give the same answer. It depends. Where do you live? Where you live determines what's on your ballot. Remember what I said about suburban versus rural versus urban? They're very different Texases right now. What we can say for certain, and Davey, I'm switching back to this one. What we can say for certain is that we would prefer you to be an issue voter, not a partisan voter. There is a subtle but important distinction we're making here. The reason is that it is strategically better if there is a wing of both parties that supports your issues. What you do not want is for your issues to become completely partisan because it makes the job so much harder mathematically. What do I mean? Do you want to organize 500 voters to swing a low turnout primary or 5,000 to swing a much larger general election? Strategically, you are in a better position if there is a wing of both parties that agrees with you. This is not a new idea. The railroad tycoon Jay Gould put it the most succinctly, though it was not his idea. He would say, I'm a Republican in a Republican district, I'm a Democrat in a Democratic district, but I am always for the Erie Railroad. He owned the Erie Railroad. It's called the friendly incumbent rule, which is if the incumbent was friendly on your issues, then you back the incumbent. It doesn't just work for robber barons. It actually works better for groups with people. Why is that? That's because money only prevails when voters aren't paying attention. When voters want to, they beat money every time. Just talk to a legislator about standardized tests. The mad moms beat the money behind the standardized testing. There's probably some other examples, but I think I made my point. This is Wayne Wheeler of the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League is the most powerful issue group, I should say, that you've probably never heard of. The Anti-Saloon League did not care if you were a Republican or a Democrat. They only cared if you were wet or dry. They created a progressive wing in each party and amended the U.S. Constitution 4 times. Now, amending the U.S. Constitution is the hardest thing to do in American politics. They did it 4 times. So how do you do this? Okay, it's just math. Say you need 9,000 people in a House race, which is a pretty good estimate about how many vote in the average primary. You don't need 9,000 more people to overpower 9,000 people. You don't even need 450 to overpower in a 9,000 person race. You need to control the margin of victory. Let me break this down. Let's look at this race and say it's likely to go 4,700 to 4,300, which is not, that's a pretty usual number. That's that 5-to-4 ratio I just showed you. Okay, you with me so far? That's a difference of what, 400 votes? 700 minus 300, 400? That means you just need 500. That's the lesson of Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League. This is how anti-vaxxers are making headway. This is how Second Amendment groups control primaries. This is what Greg Abbott and voucher proponents are trying to do. So there were 21 Republicans who voted against vouchers. 16 of those 21 are running for re-election. Each side is trying to create a block of voters in those 16 districts. If some number of the 16 are defeated, then Republican opposition to vouchers will collapse. You don't need to go 16 for 16 on their side. What's the exact number? It's not really knowable. It really depends on courage, but courage is in short supply these days. So it's not a very big number. I mean, the ballpark, 36, somewhere in there. So why are we fixated on Republicans? Well, let's break out your spreadsheets that we provided you. This one looks like this. It's in tab 4. This one is called Road to the 89th Texas House. I'll give you a few minutes to kind of flip through there. Tab 4, there are several spreadsheets. We want to make sure you know how to use them. On your roadmap, you will notice that there are really only 4 swing districts in November. And like I said earlier, maybe 10. But 10-point swings just don't happen that often. But regardless, even if there was a banner year for Democrats and they took 10 seats, they still don't control the Texas House. And in the Texas legislature, 4 does not equal 4. In this case, what I mean is that's why 4 Democrats cannot replace 4 anti-voucher Republicans. If Republican opposition to the House collapses, it's hard to see a realistic scenario where we avoid vouchers in 2025. And that would be bad for Texas school children. And it would be bad for quite a while. We would either have to rebuild support in the Republican Party or turn the state blue or some combination of both. And any of those options would take multiple election cycles to prove to elected officials. So let's look at some other concrete examples of this point that I'm trying to make. Let's look at the Uvalde bill for an example. For those who may not know, the Uvalde bill would have raised the age from 18 to 21 to buy an assault rifle. According to the University of Houston poll, 71% of Texans support being old enough to buy beer before you can buy such a weapon. But there is no evidence that these 71% of Texans vote in the Republican primary or are willing to turn the state blue. It hasn't shown up in the electoral data. We knew there was a reasonable element, so I'll back to the lobbying of this bill. We knew that there was a reasonable element of the Republican Party that was willing to vote for it. But if you want to know the whole dirty details, go talk to Bobby. There was a Herculean lobby effort just to get a vote in committee. We got it out of committee because there were 2 Republicans on the committee that we knew were for it, and it passed out of committee, where it was subsequently killed in calendars. One of those Republicans was Representative Justin Holland of Rockwall County. Predictably, this is a tweet from the governor. The governor is now trying to use this against Representative Holland in his crusade against vouchers, as are the gun rights organizations who wish to maintain that stranglehold on the Republican Party. They're trying to control the margin in the Republican primary. If Justin Holland loses, then 86 Republicans will be even more convicted that the Second Amendment absolutists can cost them re-election. Do you see how that works? Courage is in short supply. If Justin Holland prevails, then we probably gain a few more Republicans of conscience next session. Well, there will be another vote on some piece of legislation, and then there will be another primary testing whether Rockwall County was a fluke, because sometimes flukes happen. Because maybe Justin Holland won because of guns, but it could have been about public education. Who's to say, really? We got to have multiple election cycles before a fluke and an asterisk becomes a trend, becomes dogma. But if all those folks win, we gain more votes of conscience each time. Where there will be another vote, rinse and repeat. Remember the shampoo commercial? That's how elections work. And then maybe in about a decade, we will have enough diversity of thought in both political parties to have an incremental policy conversation about guns in Texas, which is where we were a decade ago. We didn't get here overnight. It took a decade to get to this place, probably take a decade to get out. Change is super slow like this. It's hard. It took Wayne Wheeler 30 years. It took the suffragists 70. Oh, bless you. Wow, man. Give her a raise. Love my colleagues. But this is the path forward. Incremental, slow commitment, using our vote smartly. Let's talk about how to use the materials we provided. We've already hinted at it a little bit, but let's go step by step. In your packet, you have this sheet. It is the key. It's just kind of entitled the key to the whole public school primaries packet we've given you of spreadsheets. Okay, who represents me? That's kind of the first step, right? Who are my elected officials? If that's where you got to begin. Now, in your case, it's on your name badge, but let's pretend we didn't give that to you. You're trying to help somebody else figure out who their representative is when you go back home and leave this event. All right, so in this spreadsheet in tab 4, you'll see the link because you might not remember who represents me. All right, it looks like this. All right, yeah, it is written, that's all right, take your time. It's written on number 9, who represents me. There's a link. And we got to find a way to get you these things digitally too. We're going to figure that out. I need to talk to her about how to do that, but we will. Right before the issue brief? Okay. So it's, in this particular packet, we printed these out to you. Again, these are living documents online. We will be updating them. We want you to have it in front of you so you remember what we're talking about. We will get you these links so that you too can use them and look at them as we update them. Yes? There may be no there's maybe no primaries after 138. I'll take a look real quick. So on this page called the key, it says who represents me. There's also a link. It's written there in case you can't remember. We'll talk about this more. Kyle is presenting tomorrow. I'm sure he's going to talk about ballot ready. We're here all week. We'll make sure that you get the digital links. Let's keep moving just for the sake of time. Once you know which House district you're even in, then you'll go to this sheet called Roadmap to the 89th Texas House. Here you'll see what's happening where you live. Now here's how you use it. Next to the district number is who the current representative is and the party that representative is a part of. In the next column is whether there's a contested primary for each political party. In other words, is there anyone to vote for? Are there 2 or more candidates that are going to be running for the party's nomination? In the column after that, it says contested general election. The question here is whether or not both parties bothered to put somebody on the ballot. So in many cases, one person from the opposite party of the incumbent will be on the ballot, but faces no opposition in the primary to be that party's candidate. Okay? And if y'all have questions about this, again, here all week, grab me in the hall. We're going to have office hours. We want to talk to you about this in depth. In the column next to that are the partisan leanings of the district. Those are percentage points based on the past performance of the district. In other words, actual election data. Thus, the likelihood of that district flipping come November. Really, this cycle, there are 4. If you live in the Rio Grande Valley, House District 37. If you're in Collin County, House District 70. If you're in South San Antonio, House District 18. And if you're in Northeast Dallas County, House District 12. Those are the 4 swing districts that anybody's really talking about being in play. Yeah. Sure, 37, Rio Grande Valley. 70, Collin County. 118, which is the middle of South San Antonio. And 112, which is Garland, but really it kind of snakes around the northeast corner of Dallas County. 3 are held by Republicans and 1's held by a Democrat. Okay, let's look at a spreadsheet entitled Every Republican or Democratic Primary for the Texas House. It is what it sounds like. It's a list of every primary by party in the Texas House. It's a list of every candidate that's filed to run. Some of these races are more real than others. Again, if you want to talk about any of these in depth, Come to the next workshop where we will be discussing the work of the Public School Defender Action Team, or come visit me or Beeman during our office hours. We are here all week to talk to you. We want you to understand the dynamics of your district. We'll tell you whatever we know. So this is a living document. In the key that I mentioned is a link to get access to this. It's public. We'll send it out. We'll be updating it regularly. The Public School Defender Action Team is actually helping do the research on these candidates. What they're researching is only about vouchers. So again, there's going to be a lot of dynamics to these races that are not about vouchers. We'll help you discern that. This one is about a candidate's support, opposition, or nuanced position on vouchers. You'll notice that we footnote it to evidence how we know what we know and why we give the green, yellow, or red color code. Green means we know they're against vouchers. Red means we know they are for it. And yellow means a nuanced position. But all that white on there means that we just do not know and we're still researching. And we got to get it done here pretty quick because early voting's in 3 weeks. Public school defenders in the room, thank you. You've been a great help on this. And hopefully we'll have a few more friends after the workshops today. But first, on the other spreadsheet, we have the Democratic primaries. We should talk about the Democratic primaries. Yes, 63 of 64 Democrats voted against vouchers. That party cohesion was not inevitable. As I said above with the slide from Republican Glenn Rogers, crediting his constituents, the same is equally true on the Democratic side. Your advocacy made a giant difference. We were really worried about a dozen Democrats. I should say we were worried about a dozen. We were really worried about half a dozen, 6 of them. Now, not all of them have challengers, so they're not on here. You can see that on a record vote spreadsheet that's coming up. These are the ones that have challengers. And you'll notice in the footnotes where 2 of them received and accepted a $10,000 campaign contribution from the voucher side. Now, $10,000 is not a small contribution in House races. If you aren't familiar with the world of campaign finance, 100 is a nice gesture. 1,000 is strong. A lot of industry groups stay in the $500 to $1,000 range. 10,000 is noticeably large. As a donor, you usually don't cut a check for $10,000 without having had a conversation or doing some due diligence. They have not returned those contributions. Just a fact. So on the Democratic side, no one is openly running on anything but support for public education. However, we are going to need to watch the campaign cash. The voucher side understands everything we just explained to you. They know they need to inject themselves into both party primaries. They are looking for 76 votes. They do not care how they get there. So we may see campaign cash appear as we get closer to Election Day, probably in the report that is required 8 days before the election. So when early voting has already started and there's little time to inform voters. So that's why we want you to know that the spreadsheet exists. It's a living document. It's updated regularly. We will get you that link, but for the paper version, to remind you that it exists. Okay, so you've looked this over, and you do not live in one of the districts, like one of the 16 districts, where your vote sends a clear message on public education. What do you do? Well, obviously, you'll want to find out what other issues might be motivating that primary, because not all things are about vouchers. We'll talk about that here in a bit. That's where you have Patrick Zvitek's spreadsheet from the Texas Tribune. In this spreadsheet that looks like the one I just put on the screen, it is in your packet as well. There's a list of, it's not? Oh, okay, we had an audible? We're going to make it available online. Good, online. So as we get you these things digitally, the thing you'll want to look for is the Patrick Zvitek spreadsheet, which you can find on his Twitter bio. It's got it pinned to the top, so if you are really curious and can't wait. But it's easy to find, and we're going to get it to you. Because he is tracking the endorsements. And the endorsements will really help you discern What is it that's motivating this primary, and what are the issues going on here? Let's talk about that a little more. So we gave you this spreadsheet. It looks like this anyway. It's the one on record votes. So there were 6 votes in the Texas House that very clearly show the ideological dividing lines that exist in both parties. The key explains what those votes are. The first one on this spreadsheet is vouchers. That's the voucher vote. The second one is 12 months health coverage for women who have just given birth or had a miscarriage. We mentioned that bill just a second ago. This one had the support of the Speaker. If a Republican voted against House Bill 12 months eligibility, then it's a good indicator that that representative is trying to stake out the farthest right-wing position possible. The next vote, number 3, is the vote on impeachment. And I want to be real clear about something. We had absolutely no position on impeachment. We believe that this is an internal matter for the legislature and not the place for an issue organization. We are telling you about it, and we include it because it helps explain why a Republican representative might have a primary challenger. Does this make sense? It is information for your purposes to help you discern who your candidates are. So in far-right politics, all roads lead to Midland. There are 3 billionaires that fund every far-right apparatus in the state. They fund the candidates, they fund the legislative staff, they fund the organizers. All sorts of organizations ultimately get their money from these 3 donors. And they fund the communications. So this is Tim Dunn. And there are 2 brothers by the last name of Wilkes. They are often referred to as Wilkes and Dunn. Think Brooks and Dunn. It's kind of Capital Insider lingo. So in this particular case, they gave a $3 million contribution to the lieutenant governor before the impeachment vote. Before the $6 million contribution from Governor Abbott, it was thought to be the largest one-time campaign donation in Texas history. And they are funding many of the candidates through the brand new PAC called Texans United for a Conservative Majority. You will find that name in the spreadsheet and many of the footnotes. They had another PAC. It was called Defend Texas Liberty. They have since closed it and opened a new one because the old PAC was caught having a meeting with a supporter of Adolf Hitler. I'm not making that up. His name was Nick Fuentes. And so they opened a new one. So if you see them or any of their funded organizations backing a candidate, then you can know that that candidate is there to purge the Republican Party and to drive it further to the right. The fourth vote was a resolution recognizing Texas Muslim Capital Day. Now, if you've ever been recognized in the Texas House, these are mundane, common, dozens every day happen without fanfare, honoring some person, some constituent, some interest group. However, because it was Muslim, 30 Republicans took the remarkable step of going to the Journal clerk in order to register their opposition. We decided to put that vote in there for you. Finally, on the Democratic side, because here's the deal, right? I mean, like if to be religiously free, if they can turn against Muslims, they can turn against Methodists. If government has that power, government cannot have that power. So finally, on the Democratic side, there were dividing lines as well. The first one, the fifth one, is based on local control, local democracy. This was the bill that preempted cities from doing all sorts of things, ranging from catching dogs to environmental regulations and payday lending. They really have taken a swing at the local government, as we mentioned earlier. So this is showing the dividing lines on the Democratic side because the Democratic Party did not hold on this vote. So a number of Democrats crossed over and voted with Republicans. So we put that vote in there so you could kind of see that. And then finally, we also put a sixth vote. This one had to do with health care, equal access to health care for people who are trans. The Democratic Party was divided on that one too. So it kind of shows you some of the fault lines on the Democratic side as well, because there are a few interesting Democratic races as well, and you may live in one of those districts. Finally, let's talk about those of you who do not have a primary at all, and those of you who may not even have a general election, because some of them are completely unopposed. You will want to focus on your school boards. All of us will want to focus on our school boards, but you especially will want to focus on your school boards. And you'll want to help in one of those districts where the voters are disproportionately going to have a say over the issues you care about. I mean, there are 150 House districts, and 16 of them are going to be the battleground for public education. That's why we've included the geographic areas in the spreadsheet so you can see where those races are occurring. You'll want to think about where your social networks are, and you'll want to do everything you can to make sure the voters in that district know what's at stake. Make sure they know just how important their vote is disproportionately this time around. If you come to the Public School Defender Workshop, we will talk more about how to do that. We want to work with you because we know you will know people through the Connectional Church, and we will have people in our database. Finally, Beeman and I are holding office hours throughout this event. Come talk to us. We want you to be an informed voter, not an overwhelmed voter. And that's because we need you to leave here and be ambassadors for your community so that they too can maximally advocate for the issues we care about. Issues that, of course, are really people. And they're people in our communities that are affected by public policy. That is all I have.